Welcome to Hello Therapy, a podcast to help you take charge of your mental health through evidence-based psychological tips and tools straight from the therapy room so that you can live life better. Are you questioning whether you're neurodivergent? Do you have an inkling that you might be autistic or maybe have ADHD or both, but you're not sure what to do next? If this sounds familiar, then this episode is for you. I'm joined by Dr. Emma Offord, who is a clinical psychologist specialising in neurodivergence. She is the founder of Divergent Life, a neuro-affirming assessment, therapy and coaching private practice service. Emma is very passionate about the neurodiversity movement, developing more empowered ways to think about neurodivergence and providing creative and somatic forms of therapy for the neurodivergent community. I personally got so much from this episode. Our discussion meanders around so many different aspects of neurodivergence, from the discovery journey and how that impacts your mental health, to understanding your sensory profile, and we also touch on trauma in the neurodivergent community. Emma also shares her personal journey of her own neurodivergent discovery and offers some pointers to anyone who is becoming aware, self-identifies, or is newly diagnosed as being neurodivergent. So let's dive in. Emma, thank you so much for joining me today on the Hello Therapy podcast. I'm so pleased that you're here.
Thank you for having me, Liz. I'm really looking forward to talking with you today.
Yeah. So I've wanted to do an episode like this for a while, actually, in that I have come across a lot of clients in my work where they are sort of newly discovering that they may be neurodivergent. And I guess what I'm learning is that there's a whole process around that, isn't there? And so I wanted an episode for us to kind of explore that and to really get into some of the issues around that. And I know that that's your specialism. So do you want to say a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, so I'm a clinical psychologist, and when I was working at the NHS, I mainly specialised in physical health. So chronic and progressive conditions is where I kind of started my career, and also worked within an area of the NHS where medical health professionals weren't quite sure what was happening for somebody, and they would send them to psychology. They couldn't identify a kind of organic cause for whatever physical symptoms were showing up. And we were called medically unexplained kind of services, really. And when I look back now, I think so much of that was actually a neurodivergent experience. People burnt out, people with chronic fatigue, chronic pain. So I feel like before I really explored neurodivergence, I was already kind of working with individuals who were neglected, I suppose, in a sense, by the medical professionals. So I think my journey began then without me really knowing. And when I started to work independently for myself, so many people were coming to my clinic and talking about what I would describe as neurodivergent traits, or a really, really strong theme was OCD, people talking about obsessive compulsive cycles. So I started to really explore this area of neurodivergence, and from there, I decided that I wanted to create a service that was neuro-affirming and completely dedicated to neurodivergence. So I created Divergent Life, and that's pretty much what I'm doing right now.
Brilliant. And I love your content on social media. It's very destigmatizing. You talk a lot about diagnoses and language and narratives and things, which hopefully we'll get into in our conversation. And also you mentioned that OCD, which is my specialism. We could have a whole podcast episode on OCD and neurodivergence. But yeah, so let's get into it then. Shall we get really clear on terms, first of all, for people that are listening that maybe don't know some of the terms? So what do we mean by neurodivergence?
Okay, I will do my best to explain, but this is just to clarify that this is like an emerging area for many people. And so it's evolving, it's organic, and terms are changing all the time. And some people will prefer different terms to other people. So I'll do my best to give a kind of broad understanding, but yes, it's always kind of recommended to ask any individual what their preference is around any of these terms. So we can start with the term neurodiversity, which is kind of like biodiversity. It's recognizing the variation in each and every individual. So we are all, every human being, every animal is neurodiverse. We are all different. We have different neurobiological wiring. And in our kind of current society, we would describe neurodivergent as anybody who lies outside of the predominant neurotype. So, Liz, you will understand this from a psychologist point of view, the way that we have constructed the idea of mental illness and mental health problems and disorders is to categorize people as being either within statistically the norm or the normal range, or if you show what they call symptoms outside of the normal range, then you are considered disordered and to have a particular diagnosis. So, using that model and that language, neurodivergent individuals would fall outside of that kind of what's considered a predominant neurotype and normal range of human experience. Now, that is a really, really tricky area, and there's a lot we can say about that. That is a podcast in itself as well. I don't conform to the language of disorder, and I never have, and I never will. It's not my model. It's not the way that I would have designed ideas about mental health and human experience. But that's what we have to work with. So people who are neurodivergent are considered or might be described as autistic, OCD, people who've experienced trauma, dyslexia, ADHD, dyscalculia. There's a whole range of what we as society call disorders that are what we call or are starting to call neurodivergent individuals. That's a kind of introduction to that.
That's great. No, that's a really great introduction. And it is easy, isn't it, if you don't know much about this area, to get really confused. Because, as you say, the dominant model is the medical model, and the idea of disorder is so problematic. And how would you say that at this point in time, where our understanding and the research stands at the moment, like how can we navigate that, particularly if you are someone who's, say, neurotypical, i.e. doesn't identify with one of these labels, like or diagnoses, or isn't neurodivergent? What do you say about that? How can we navigate this world where we have to use the language of disorder, at least at the moment?
Yeah, I find that really problematic, the language. That's one of the main changes that I'm trying to promote in my work and with people that I work with. Throughout the medical model is full of language like disorder, illness. It's very medicalized, it's very physical. There's terms like severely disordered or deficits or deficient. It's all about lacking. It's all about not measuring up. It's all about kind of failure to be a predominant neurotype, to be a neurotypical person. And I think it positions people as less than. And yeah, it's hugely problematic. So I think one of the main things that needs to change is the language. And of course, behind the language is ideology, like how people actually, we use that language to describe the beliefs that we hold about people. So, we change the language, but we need to change the beliefs as well, that these individuals, these neurodivergent individuals, because they have a different way of relating to their sensory world or a different way of processing information or communicating and have preferences for doing things in a particular way, are somehow less than and need to be changed or need to be medicated or need to be labeled or othered. So yeah, the language is a huge component of all of this.
And as you say, it's the focus on like pathology and abnormality, like this idea of you're either normal or you're abnormal, that shapes how we experience ourselves and how we experience other people. So my interest in this for this episode was around, someone that is maybe on social media or they've been on TikTok, they're like, oh my goodness, this is me, when there's a video about ADHD, say, or someone who's autistic and describing their life experiences. When you have seen clients or when you see clients, what are they coming to you with in terms of their understanding of themselves within that context?
It's really, really varied. So I think, yeah, other factors absolutely play a part. The kind of time of life that they're making this discovery, whether they've already received a sort of diagnosis before, they therefore their exposure and their understanding to the medical model and these ideas about mental health problems and being disordered. So people come with a whole history, I suppose, of understanding and misunderstanding. But a lot of the time, people are coming to, and certainly if they come to me because I speak about being neuro-affirming and I talk about not wanting to use the medical model and to think outside of those constraints. And so I think certain people come to me already thinking about that because I've been talking about it. And so a lot of those individuals are ready for a really interesting discussion and exploration of what I call their neurobiological wiring. So how their minds and bodies work, their neurodivergent minds and their neurodivergent bodies, and how that interacts and has intersected with their life events and all the history that they come with as well. So yeah, people are also asking the very same questions that you're asking, Liz. They're saying to me, like, am I disordered? I kind of need to know if I'm neurodivergent, and I need that to feel very secure, and I need that to feel validated and confirmed. And so that then tends to then lean into the more medical model, because we can do a diagnostic assessment and say, okay, according to this model, you are autistic or you are ADHD. And so on the one hand, people kind of want that certainty and to feel that belonging to a group, or the kind of identification of the community, I suppose, around neurodivergence or a particular neurodivergent. But then other people, or the same people, are really confused by this whole idea of being disordered and the stigma that goes with that, and actually not wanting that part of that identity. So I think it's really important to help people with that internal struggle and wanting to belong and wanting a community and wanting certainty, and that being a healing process at the same time if the medical model doesn't fit for them.
Yeah. And certainly in my years of working, what I've found is quite a common experience seems to be someone doesn't feel like they ever fit in to social groups or school or their friendships. There was always something that it felt like something prevented them from fitting in. And there can be a lot of, I think, self-esteem issues because of that, can't there? And I'm interested in, again, your experience around the kind of challenges that someone who is neurodivergent or is autistic or has ADHD, what are some of the challenges that they might experience through their lives, would you say?
So many, so many challenges. And yeah, so what you said there, Liz, about like outside looking in. So many people describe feeling they don't belong, or they don't quite get what's going on, or they feel different, or they're uncomfortable with certain kind of social norms or ways of doing things. So that's a really common thread of feeling just different without being able to explain what that is or to define that. So that's a huge struggle for people. And we talk a lot in this community about masking, about concealment and camouflaging. So, a lot of individuals are also coming from a kind of life where they've felt different and then they've adapted to fit into a school, a place of work, a community, a relationship, a family, and have taken on the identity, the ways of living that, their environment has dictated or suggested is the right way to do things. And so some of those struggles are born out of trying to fit in and I always call it the me I should be, kind of living up to this idea that I should be a particular way, yet I don't feel that's right for me, or it's not coming naturally to me to be that way. And so people are masking, and as a result of that, feeling like any minute I'll be found out. So there's a lot of anxiety and fear. The mask might slip, I'll be found out and, be seen to be an imposter, be rejected for who I am. So a huge amount of fear. Or the mask does slip, and that kind of authentic self shows up, and it's responded to really negatively by a teacher or by a parent or by a friendship group. And, that just reinforces this idea that I'm different and wrong and I should be a completely different way. There's also a lot of burnout that people experience. People are exhausted, trying to live a life that doesn't suit their neurobiological wiring. And I'm yet to work with a neurodivergent individual who hasn't experienced some level of trauma. So that could be sort of relational trauma, this being rejected for who you authentically are. It could be sensory trauma. So, for example, being sensory sensitive to noise or light or touch, and having to be in an environment that's very noisy, or, is like a sensory assault to that person on a daily basis. See a lot of this with school children. So there's so many presentations that people show up with.
Yeah. And where my mind went to then around, if you're sensitive to touch, for example, like within a relationship, if you're in a relationship with someone who, one of their needs is affection, for example, then that's going to be a real friction point, isn't it? And cause difficulties. And I think if you don't have an understanding of your sensory profile, and that is something that you're experiencing, and that is how your brain is wired, then the narrative becomes something different. It's about, well, you have attachment issues, or you don't love me as much as you say you do. It's that, even something relatively seemingly small can have a huge impact, can't it?
Absolutely. And I think this is one of the main reasons people find the neurodiversity paradigm, that this whole concept about neurodivergence and diversity, neurobiological diversity, so liberating, and literally having like an aha moment. So, when I talk to people about something like that, their sensory profile and sensory dynamics, the other person in your life that you're very close to might have a completely different sensory profile, therefore completely different sensory needs. I always talk about, like in my own household, that my husband, I would consider him to be low registration, where he needs a lot of sensory input for his brain to register, for his nervous system to pick up on things. And those very same things I'm sensory sensitive to. So I will walk into a room that he's occupied and it will be like a sensory assault to me. It is the least relaxing experience. So the TV is on a really high volume, all the lights are on. There's like mess everywhere that has not been registered. And my nervous system is really stressed immediately. And so I want to turn the volume down. I want to put the dimmers on. I want clean spaces. Just in a relationship, you could completely see how that could be retold through the eyes of our society as, I could get labeled in so many ways. And so could he, as maybe being lazy or, inconsiderate, or I could be selfish or, over the top and dramatic. But those are our sensory needs and preferences. And, I'm less irritated by the situation now that I understand his sensory profile more. It's like, okay, you're just different, rather than this is intentional. And I just think that is for everybody. Everyone could have that sensory dynamic going on.
Yeah. And as you say, having that understanding of yourself, that's a huge advantage, isn't it, in your life, in your relationships. So that process of self-discovery of, I'm neurodivergent. I was listening to a podcast this morning, actually, Divergent Conversations with Dr. Megan Anna, and they were talking about the process of, they called it grief and relief, the process of sort of realizing or getting a diagnosis of something, and how there is a whole grieving process that goes along with that, but also there is the relief and the sort of sense of, now I know, and now I can understand myself, and now there's a community that I can tap into. Is that something that you experienced? Because I know that you've talked about your neurodivergence. What was that like for you, your discovery?
I definitely identify with the grief and relief. And I know that so many of the people I work with, or whose stories I've listened to, do as well. I mean, for me personally, I had, I think, my own unique experience in that I didn't do a huge amount of grieving. What I did was extensively hyper-focus to probably like a unhealthy level. So once I had the relief of this discovery, I decided I needed to know everything. And
Okay.
so I just deep dived and I couldn't stop. I literally
Mm.
could not stop. So I often describe that my neurodivergence is very often to automatically go into a fight response rather than a flight. So yeah, I want to know, I want to change the world. I just go into this
Yeah.
whole zone. So I didn't leave a lot of space for grieving. So for me, there wasn't a huge amount of grief. I just felt safety. I thought, oh,
Mm.
now I've got something to go back to a lot of people and say,
Yeah.
"You've got this wrong about me, and here's why." So it felt very powerful, very empowering for me. I know a lot of other people feel that a lot of life was stolen, a lot of opportunities were stolen without having this knowledge, and I completely get that. And had they had that knowledge, things may have been different, and they might have not been as exposed to so much trauma. They might not have had so much loss along the way. So
Mm.
there's an absolute restructuring process that takes place for people. Mine was at hyper speed and in this kind
Yeah.
of like, right, just gonna take this on and embrace this. And I think other people probably feel that too. And other people's restructuring can be a combination where
Mm.
you're really, reconsidering your identity through this
Yeah.
lens. It's huge, actually.
Yeah, it's a massive process, isn't it? And one
Mhm.
that takes time because as you say, the way that you see yourself and how you identify, not just with yourself, like the relationship with yourself, but also with others, it shifts, doesn't it? And I think there's like an unlearning process as well, like unlearning and learning at the same time. Was that
Yeah.
what it was like for you?
Yeah, it's definitely, I kind of call it unlearning and relearning or deconstruction and reconstruction.
Okay.
There's another term, positive disintegration, which is kind of part of the giftedness community, but I think that also fits because it is like a disintegration, this sort of nuclear experience
Mm.
sometimes for individuals. So yeah, the unlearning was incredible for me. And then the relearning is still ongoing. I'm still discovering
Mm.
corners and pockets of neurodivergence. I still have questions. There's still a lot unresearched, unknown. There's a lot of fuzziness, but there's also a lot of certainty and a lot of truth. There are things that you just know. As soon as I kind of trained and read and learned about the sensory side of things, it just made so much sense. Like I didn't really need to study for that to just to hear those words, sensory sensitive or
Yeah.
sensory seeking. Like I'm a high sensory seeker as well. It's like, oh, okay, that makes a lot of sense. That gave my parents a lot of worry around sensory seeking and choosing to do things because I kind of needed that dopamine. I needed that
Mm.
central nervous system experience. I was driven towards certain things. So yeah, it just makes sense even without a huge amount of research and
Yeah.
knowledge.
Can you say a bit more about sensory profiles? Because I
Mhm.
guess what does get talked about a lot is the labels, right? Or the,
Yeah.
it's autism or it's ADHD. But my sense, and I have limited knowledge around this, so excuse me if I get it wrong, but like we all have a sensory profile, right? Whether we're neurodivergent or not. And I think what I'm getting from you is that maybe we could all do with understanding what our sensory profiles are like. But for neurodivergent individuals, how is it? Is it different or is it more pronounced? Like what's the understanding around it?
I think the sensory understanding people's sensory profiles explains a lot about, like we talked about sensory dynamics, our relationships.
Mm.
Explains a lot about our state of well-being. So, the sensory input directly impacts our central nervous system, which can put us into fight, flight, freeze, peace type responses, or it can help regulate us and put us in a connected, calm place. And in those states, our organs are affected, our whole kind of
Mm.
cognitive functioning is impacted. So that sensory input is organizing our mind and our bodies. And we never switch off from sensory input. While we're sleeping, we are still
Mm.
receiving sensory information. So everybody has a sensory profile, and it depends how you look at that. So some sensory profiling will look at the categories of, I've mentioned before, low registration, needing more input, sensory sensitivity. So your nervous system has a lower threshold for certain sensory information. sensory seeking. So you actively seek out to have that sensory input, and sensory avoiding, where you are trying to stay away from things that make you feel uncomfortable. And some people might be predominantly a sensory seeker or a sensory sensitive person. Some people might have a real mixture. So I'm definitely spiky. I have a lot of different sensory sensitivities and sensory seeking. And then you might have some people who are very kind of more neutral, where they're not seeking it out, they're not particularly bothered, or not enjoying or not enjoying a certain sensory experience. And maybe you might say that that could be considered the more predominant neurotype, are those people who are not as affected by sensory information. Sometimes sensory seekers are seen to be more of an ADHD profile. I wouldn't say it's exclusive to that whatsoever, but that can often be shorthand, maybe. And sensory sensitive is often attributed more to an autistic experience. But again, I think that needs a lot more explanation and looking at, because I see a range within people. And also in terms of OCD, what's almost never discussed is sensory sensitivity and the disgust response, and how that plays a role in then sensory avoiding, which looks and is very much an OCD cycle for people. So I think it explains a lot. You can even look at eating disorders as well and think, you know, behind that there are a lot of sensory sensitivities to texture, to taste, even to foods touching. So how the composition of your meal, all kinds of different things that might contribute to what we call these, you know, disorders or experiences that people have.
That just triggered a memory actually for me on my training back in, well, I started my training in 2004, 20 years ago. And autism at that point was talked about in terms of, you know, sort of the things to look out for will be, yes, if a child doesn't like certain foods, or they don't like their foods touching, like you were saying there. But that, you know, thinking back on it now, my training or back then, the understanding of autism and other neurotypes was, I mean, it's so simplistic, it seems like now, because even what you were saying there about this very rich concept of sensory profiling or sensory profiles, that wasn't talked about, and it's still not really talked about that much, is it?
No, it's really not. And it's like in the field of psychology, almost non-existent. It's much more occupational therapists who have investigated and used this concept. You'll see in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, the DSM, that sensory related issues or problems are discussed. It's not like a diagnosable thing. It's not considered, you know, a construct in its own right. Whereas in occupational therapy, it's taken very seriously, and there's a lot of research that goes on there, but it's not given the status. And it's not given the space to be talked about. And I think in actual fact, it's a huge component of our experience. I went and got trained by an occupational therapist to get this understanding. I realized that, look, I need to know this. I need to know this, and I don't.
Yeah. And it's really interesting when you think about it within the OCD realm, because as you say, that disgust response is so huge for I'd say most sort of themes or types of OCD. And so if you think about it in terms of like the motivation to get pulled into a compulsion, if you're seeing it through the sensory lens, it really changes the way that you think about it, and perhaps the way you also treat it as well, and as doing the therapy with someone. If you're a clinician or a psychologist or therapist who is doing exposure response prevention, you know, a big part of that is someone exposing themselves to, let's say, you know, with contamination OCD, it's about putting your hand in a toilet and things like that. But if you have a particularly, you know, in terms of the sensory profile that you have, that's going to be really aversive. Like it's difficult to do anyway, but really aversive. And I'm guessing that you would really need to think carefully about the exposures and the therapy around it.
Definitely. It's potentially traumatizing or re-traumatizing for people. So I talk a lot to people about accommodations, like where are we going to draw the line here between, do we try to use more traditional methods around OCD therapy? Is it appropriate in this case? And sometimes it is. It can be both. Sometimes people will get by with their accommodations, and in other cases, they might need some themes where you might do, you know, ERP, exposure response prevention, you might do EMDR, you might do some kind of more trauma-based work. I think it's another layer to it that's missing. And I think without that other layer. It's very problematic. And both of us know, ERP has a huge, so many individuals will drop out of doing that kind of therapy. Yes, it might be successful, but it's for the percentage who stay, which isn't huge. Lots of people cannot do that. And some of my clients, like when I explain about ERP, they look petrified. I can see in their faces, they're terrified. And, then we actually get by with some of the accommodations that it's about what do they want out of life and honoring that. And that's what neuro-affirming is. It's not saying, no, this is what the evidence says we have to do, therefore we have to do it. It's actually treating that human in front of you with this extra layer of information.
And that's so interesting because, I mean, you'll know as a clinical psychologist, what's drummed into you is got to follow the evidence base. And it's about nice guidelines. And whilst it's great to have a guideline around a particular mental health difficulty, but applying that rigidly is not going to be helpful for individuals, particularly neurodivergent individuals.
Absolutely. And I always say it's called a guideline. It's not called like it's not a manual that you have to follow. It's giving you helpful suggestions or, an evidence-based approach, but that evidence base is built upon research that holds a particular point of view. There are emerging evidence bases that are less investigated. They are emerging, but they are still, very valid and very important. And we should be paying attention. I think it's really irresponsible to take a guideline and it's very kind of defensive practice, isn't it? It's more like I have to, like, it's not thinking about the person, it's thinking about what you have to do. And you don't. I think it's really, really interesting to be a bit more of a hybrid therapist where you are taking occupational therapy, their ideas, and you're also looking at grassroots, like what are people actually saying about their own experience. So you're bringing this hybrid model that I think is much more relevant to people and much more compassionate.
Absolutely. Say you're someone who, as I mentioned before, sort of TikTok and social media. So you're someone that is thinking that you might be neurodivergent, but you're not sure what that means for you. What would you say to someone like that? So we know the waiting lists are very long. If you do want to go down the assessment and diagnosis route, a lot of people can't afford the assessment, private assessments. They're usually very expensive, aren't they? Or, the cost of living crisis and everything. Like, it's difficult for people to access that. What piece of advice would you give to someone who is self-diagnosing?
I think it's like any other construct that we think about in society. I don't think anybody would hold themselves back from picking up a book about introversion or about problem solving. Or, people would go and explore that and apply it to themselves and, think that's really interesting. Am I going to label myself as like introvertedly disordered? No, the problem is more about this medical model, this idea that you have to receive a diagnosis for it to be valid. And I get that. I get people would like to go through that process sometimes for those reasons, because it does hold a bit of power, I suppose, to have, to go through a process with a professional. And children will probably need that document in order to access resources. But for those who don't need it as an advocacy tool, then you can read about sensory profiling, you can read about executive functioning, you can read about communication styles, you can pick up a book about autism and ADHD. There's a wealth of information. There's so much available in terms of lower cost training that people can do, access programs that help them to self-identify. There are self-identification methods where people can do free screenings online and go through that process. So I think there's a lot that can be done, but it's kind of you have to let go of the medical model a little bit in order to think that that's enough. And it is.
Yeah. And what then happens next? So if someone has done the reading and is pretty sure that they're neurodivergent and perhaps they're struggling a bit, or their workplace isn't neuro-affirming, so they're struggling a bit there and they're in a big open plan office that's really noisy. Again, what can that person do or think about to sort of help themselves?
So that's where the diagnosis does become this advocacy empowering tool. Kind of say, hey, I have this diagnosis, therefore I'm going to need this environment to honour that and to make changes and allow accommodations. Really, you should be able to ask for that anyway, but that's just not where we're at right now. So then it sort of becomes, I guess, more your responsibility to design that yourself. An example might be if you're working in that kind of environment that you described, and that is going to impact your nervous system in such a way that it exhausts it or it puts you in a stress response, then you're probably going to need to consider what I call buffer time or energy counting. How do you then downregulate? How do you then reset your nervous system? So maybe you do need some therapy to help work through that, or some kind of process. It is tough to work all of that out by yourself. You can also join communities and have those conversations with other people who've done it. So there are different ways, but I'm very much supportive of the idea of designing your life around your neurobiology and your nervous system to protect your mental health, to protect your physical health. I think it's incredibly important. So as an example, it's not that straightforward or that easy. When I worked in the NHS, I would work in a room that was shared with many other clinicians, and the windows were bolted down. So that's just how it was in the hospital that I worked. You couldn't open a window. The door had to remain shut for confidentiality. It would get really hot in that room. And
No
my
aircon
skills, no
or
aircon,
fans.
nothing, bare minimum. And my sensory sensitivity to smell, certain smells, would trigger my disgust response. So sometimes when people would have certain kind of lunch that would smell a particular way, it would give me like a gag reflex. So, I couldn't explain. I didn't really understand everything at that point. But can you imagine saying, "I'm really sorry, you can't have that lunch," if I'm in the room? They're hard accommodations to ask for. People will judge them. So I think it's going in with your eyes open. So what I would then do is go for a walk and have my lunch outside, and just I knew then what to do. Now I can really understand it and explain it, and I think it helps with that whole internal narrative that it's okay for me to not like this, and it's okay for me to make a choice. Whereas I think a lot of people will carry that internal narrative of like, you're just a mean person for like sort of feeling so kind of frustrated towards that other person and their lunch. But it's just even to those minor details of like lunch or lighting. I mean, they're not minor. I just mean they're kind of daily events that we wouldn't normally consider contributing to our mental health, but they do.
And when you also then think about the added layer of the context, the expectation that you should be able to just sit in an office and do your work, regardless of whether the windows are bolted down or not, or you can't open the door, or there's someone eating their lunch. That's what neurodivergent individuals have to contend with.
Yeah.
It's these environments, and we could go down a whole rabbit hole in talking about schools and the education system.
Yeah.
But that's a massive example of how there's a system there that is not allowing for individuals, children to thrive. Essentially, they're expected to sit on a chair most of the time in a stuffy classroom.
Yeah, absolutely. In itchy, scratchy uniforms. The whole nervous system is just responding to that all the time. And I experienced what we call bore out. So we've talked about burnout, but like the boredom so boredom affecting my nervous system is off the scale. And, as a professional in the NHS, there are expectations about how you behave in meetings and certain things that you have to do. And my bore out would be off the scale. And I would be so kind of stressed and frazzled really as a result of that creativity not being able to be expressed, having to do things a particular way, sit for really long times listening to what I considered boring information and without being able to stand up. Again, no open windows, no fresh air, all of those things hugely affected my nervous system, my ability to kind of process information, my contribution, all kinds of things. It's really huge.
There is work being done, isn't there, in terms of, I know there's certainly I come across it on LinkedIn, a lot of neuro-affirming businesses and workplaces. So it's starting to get through, but there's still a lot of work to be done. And I know that today we have focused, I guess, more on the kind of negative side of neurodivergence, but I know also that you put a lot of effort and work into talking about the positive aspects of neurodivergence. So can you say a little bit about that?
Yes, I would love to. I'm so passionate about it, and it's, never ever to minimize the experiences, those negative experiences and the real struggles that people go through. But that medical model really puts such a huge constraint on our understanding about people's strengths. And being what I would identify as OCD and ADHD, sometimes those OCD cycles and moments are really, really unpleasant. But I know that, my strength is hyper-focusing and just the ability to learn at a rapid rate. And I attribute that to my OCD, ADHD type wiring. There's so many wonderful unexpressed parts of people's neurobiology that it is exiled, as a result of society. It is put in the corner in the attic. It's not expressed. And so I feel like I, absolutely want to remind people that is a part of your wiring, and under the right conditions, with the right sensory inputs, with the right preferred way of processing and learning, it can transform a person's experience, and they can flourish and they can thrive under different conditions. And I've seen it. I see it all the time. It's, really is something that's so neglected. And interestingly, it's something that kind of polarizes. People want to talk about strengths. Some people are really not wanting to have that conversation. And I'm definitely saying that there are both elements, struggles and strengths. I'm not saying it's all about the strengths. But why would we not talk about that? I think it's hugely important to do that.
Absolutely. Well, I've really enjoyed our chat today, and I hope that you come back, because there's so many areas that I'd love to talk to you about, particularly like giftedness. I know, again, that's another area that you talk about a lot on your social media. Fascinating area. I don't know much about it, so I'd just love to get you on again and have a chat about it.
I would love to come back, Liz. And
I put you on the spot there, sorry.
Not at all. No, I really, really, I really enjoyed this conversation. I love speaking with you, and I love your enthusiasm for this area as well, and wanting to explore it. So thank you for giving me a bit of space to talk about my interests. And I'll definitely come back.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Hello Therapy. If you found it helpful, don't forget to subscribe, follow and review. You can get more wellbeing and mental health tips by joining our email list and visiting the resources section of our website at harleyclinical.co.uk. The Hello Therapy podcast and the information provided by me, Dr. Liz White, is solely intended for information and educational purposes and does not constitute personalised advice. Please do reach out to your GP or a mental health professional if you need support. Until next time, take care of yourself.